So it's 2025 and we've got DLSS 4, FSR 4, frame generation and even path tracing. GPUs have gotten faster and much more expensive. But today, we're rewinding the clock to take a look at one of the most iconic cards in GPU history, the GTX 1080. Can this 8-year-old beast still hold its own in modern titles? Let's find out. Released all the way back in May of 2016, the GTX 1080 was Nvidia's first consumer GPU built on the Pascal architecture, featuring a 16nm process and a base clock of 1607 MHz. It packed 8GB of GDDR5X memory, 2560 CUDA cores, and 180W TDP. At launch, this card was a game changer. It offered massive performance gains over the GTX 980 while being surprisingly efficient. In many ways, it defined a generation of gaming. But how does it hold up almost a decade later in 2025 when games are far more demanding? For today's test, we're pairing the GTX 1080 with a Ryzen 5 5600, an incredibly solid budget CPU even in 2025. We're using 16GB of DDR4 RAM at 3600 MHz, and we're using an NVMe SSD for our benchmarks. And we're also using the latest version of Windows 11 24H2. And we will actually be comparing the performance to a recent video we done on the RX 580. So because of that, we are using the same settings that we used on that card when available. That way we can compare the 1080 to the RX 580 just to see the difference in performance, seeing as both these cards can be found for under £100. Okay, so for the first game we tested Fortnite on performance mode, low settings, so competitive settings, and this is a CPU intensive game and especially even more so in performance mode, but we've seen an average FPS of around 240, which is to be expected. Now our 1% lows were quite bad, but it does take quite a few games or quite a bit amount of time for Fortnite to compile all the shaders. So 1% low figures in Fortnite and at least performance mode always do remain bad, at least for a little while. We also tested DX12 with a far view distance and everything else on low, and we've seen a very respectable 180 FPS, in which our 1% lows also struggled a bit, being at around 60. But overall, it was an enjoyable experience, and this graphics card is most definitely suited for esports titles like Fortnite. Now heading over to GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, initially we played on a very high preset, where we've seen a very respectable average FPS of 90, and our 1% low figures were extremely good as well, with no stuttering or any sort of performance issues in this game. We also did go ahead and test it out on the high preset, because that's what we tested the RX 580 on, and we did see a very nice jump up in performance, way over 100 FPS, averaging around 120 FPS. Now of course a game like GTA 5, putting it on a very high preset and playing it around 90 FPS is absolutely fine and it feels great as well, but it's nice to know that if you lower the settings a bit, you are able to see them triple digit FPS numbers. So overall GTA 5 Enhanced Edition was absolutely playable and an enjoyable experience on the GTX 1080. Now moving on to Counter-Strike 2, we played on a medium preset just to push the FPS numbers as high as possible, and overall it was a really enjoyable and smooth experience compared to the RX 580 where we had extremely bad 1% lows and occasional stutters. This was absolutely smooth. Even though our 1% low figures weren't the best, our average FPS was definitely a lot higher, and overall the gameplay was a lot smoother compared to that graphics card. And I'm not sure if there was an issue with the graphics card or the driver at the time, but all I know is that on the GTX 1080 Counter-Strike 2 was absolutely playable and we were seeing very high FPS numbers, so it was most definitely playable and suitable for this card. Now moving over to Forza Horizon 5, we initially played on the medium preset, and this was so we could make a comparison to the RX 580. Even though the 1080 and the 580 are not direct competitors, they both are older budget graphics cards, So I thought it'd be good to show at the end of the video the comparisons between these cards on the same or similar settings. But overall on medium preset, we've seen an average of around 120 FPS with some extremely impressive 1% lows of 114, so that means the game was extremely smooth with no performance issues whatsoever. But we did then go ahead and up it to an ultra preset, which I would say is probably more suitable for this graphics card. But we still seen a very respectable FPS number on this setting. Actually, our FPS on the Ultra preset with the 1080 I believe was higher than our RX 580 on a medium preset. But either way, on the Ultra preset we averaged around 95 FPS with our 1% lows being around 74. So once again, an easy to run game like Forza Horizon 5, and obviously it's not the latest or greatest title, it definitely is suitable for this graphics card. Now at this point in the video you might be thinking, SpecBench, are you even going to test this graphics card in some newer games? Well yes, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is our last easy to run game, which we actually played at a high preset and we did use it in game benchmark. Now it's important to note that some of these benchmarks may show that you're going to get much higher FPS than what you would actually play in the game, and this is because a lot of them are cutscenes and a lot of them are open areas, so you may be seeing anywhere up to like 60-70 FPS more than what you'd actually get when playing through the story. But in the actual benchmark, by the end of it we averaged 120 FPS, so I would probably say when you're actually playing the game on this setting you're probably going to see anywhere between 90 to 110 FPS. It all depends on the actual scenario in game. But Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a very old but actually very loved game, is most definitely suitable for this graphics card and it will run absolutely fine on high settings. Now for Marvel Rivals, we played on a medium preset but we turned off global illumination and the reflection quality. We both set them to off. Now I'm sure there's other settings you could put to low or off and keep a few high, really to just keep the clarity good but also maximize your FPS. But I didn't want to get too complicated with the settings we were going to use. But honestly, Marvel Rivals run absolutely fine on these settings. We were seeing over 90 FPS on average, with our 1% lows being at around 60. Now when we compare that to the RX 580, we had to play with, I believe, FSR, maybe even the lowest quality setting, and we were struggling to get a smooth and enjoyable experience, especially because we were having to use upscaling on that card. It made the inputs and the overall game's input delay just feel completely horrible, but this actually felt playable and I'd happily play this game on these settings and on this configuration. So overall I think Marvel Rivals is a success and is most definitely playable on this card, and as mentioned previously you could just adjust the settings accordingly yourself and get even higher FPS. Now for Black Ops 6, we played on a balanced preset but we did turn off bullet impact and static reflection quality we set to low, and we also did use Nvidia image scaling rather than using FSR like we did with the RX 580, and overall we averaged around 82 FPS. And for our 1% lows we were seeing anywhere between 50 to 60. Now this map is quite small and chaotic and I honestly was just getting killed the whole time. And I'm curious to know whether if we played on a slightly larger map would our FPS be a little bit higher, maybe in the 90s, closer to 100, as this was just full chaos running around this tiny little kind of building. But Black Ops 6 was actually playable compared to, like I said, the RX 580. Not only was we getting much lower FPS, but on that card this game did really feel unplayable. It just felt horrible, not responsive, and just overall kind of somewhat laggy and choppy. But yeah, I honestly think Black Ops 6 on this graphics card is playable. And once again, this is a game where you have got a lot of settings, so you could adjust things accordingly to how you want the game to look and run, and then possibly get even more FPS. But it's nice to see in a game like Black Ops 6 that it is playable on an 8-year-old graphics card. So overall, I think Black Ops 6 was a success as well. Now for Black Myth Wukong, we played at a medium preset and we did have FSR enabled. This game does force upscaling, so having a newer graphics card on these games is kind of more suitable, because that way you have got access to features like DLSS, which will boost frame rates but also make the game still look pretty good and actually feel quite responsive and smooth as well. But overall, after playing some Black Myth Wukong, we've seen an average FPS of around 100, and our 1% lows were pretty good as well at about 85 FPS. Now for Cyberpunk 2077, we played on a medium preset, but we had FSR 3.0 enabled, and honestly we got a very respectable FPS number in this benchmark. By the end of the benchmark run, we've seen an average FPS of around 95, with our 1% lows being around 70 to 75. So I definitely think this game is playable with this graphics card, and I was overall quite surprised. I mean, the GTX 1080 does pack a punch, but it is older now, and the 10 series does not support DLSS or any sort of modern upscaling technology. But Cyberpunk 2077, even with being a demanding game, actually run completely fine on this card. So, what's my verdict for the GTX 1080? Is it still worth it in 2025? So I would definitely say that for the price, a GTX 1080 packs a lot of performance. Now, I would say the biggest downside is the fact that it doesn't support features like DLSS, and it is 8 years old. Now, I know that even some of the older generation cards like the 9 series and maybe even the 7 series, they still have some sort of drivers, but I believe they don't get the latest drivers now, and if you're trying to play a newer title, you could run into issues where it says your graphics card driver is outdated. So that is something to take into consideration if you're going to pick up a 10 series graphics card. But in terms of its price to performance, it really packs a punch and it is worth it. Now, as I always mention, at the around £100 mark for buying a used graphics card, there isn't a bunch of options, but you may be able to find something like a 2060 or possibly 2060 Super for around £100, and that way you will have features like DLSS, and you'll be able to boost your frame rates even more with that, and you will have longer driver support, so you wouldn't have to worry so much about the card being outdated and unusable due to not getting driver updates anymore. But please let me know in the comments what you think of this graphics card. I really think it still is a great contender, and it's just the sheer fact that it's getting older now, and with games trying to force things like DLSS or any sort of upscaling, it's making it harder for this graphics card to actually compete at the budget level. But I hope you enjoyed the video, guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.